They stood at the altar, hands trembling, eyes locked. Everyone in that small chapel in Ohio said it was the most beautiful ceremony they'd ever seen. The way Michael looked at Sarah, like she held his entire world in her hands. The way she smiled back, radiant in white lace, tears streaming down her cheeks. Happy tears, everyone assumed. But if you looked closer, really looked, you might have seen something else hiding behind those eyes. Fear. Because Sarah knew something Michael didn't. Something she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it didn't matter anymore. And in less than 12 hours, that secret would tear through their perfect beginning like a storm neither of them saw coming. What Michael discovered that night wasn't just shocking. It would test everything he believed about love, trust, and the woman he'd just vowed to spend his life with. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This isn't a story about betrayal in the way you might think. It's about the secrets we carry to protect ourselves, the shame that isn't ours to bear, and the moment when hiding becomes harder than revealing. It's about a 28-year-old woman who believed she was damaged goods, and a 29-year-old man who thought he knew everything about the person he married. They'd dated for 3 years, talked about everything from childhood dreams to retirement plans, laughed until their stomachs hurt, and built what everyone called a foundation of complete honesty. But there was one thing Sarah never said out loud. One night from her past that she'd locked away so tightly she'd nearly forgotten how to access it herself. And on what should have been the happiest night of their lives, that lock would shatter. Let me take you back 6 years before that wedding day. Sarah was 22, fresh out of college with a marketing degree and dreams bigger than the small town she grew up in. She'd moved to Columbus to start her career, leaving behind the familiar streets where everyone knew her name and her family's history. Her parents were good people, church-going folks who ran the local hardware store and believed in hard work, honesty, and faith. They'd raised Sarah to be strong, independent, and careful. But no amount of caution can always protect you from the unpredictable cruelty that sometimes finds its way into our lives. Sarah was 3 months into her first real job when it happened. She'd been working late on a campaign pitch, determined to prove herself to her new boss. The office building was mostly empty by 8 p.m., just a few scattered lights on different floors where other ambitious young professionals pushed through their exhaustion. She'd left through the parking garage, keys already in her hand like her father had taught her. She'd parked under a light, checked her surroundings, moved with purpose. She'd done everything right. But the man who grabbed her from behind didn't care about her precautions. He was a stranger, someone who'd followed her from the coffee shop where she'd picked up dinner, someone whose face she barely saw in the struggle that followed. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes, but it fractured something inside her that would take years to even begin repairing. When it was over, he disappeared into the shadows between buildings, and Sarah sat on the cold concrete, her professional clothes torn, her body shaking so violently she couldn't stand. She didn't scream. She didn't call the police right away. She just sat there, trying to understand how her whole world had changed in the time it takes to microwave a meal. The police were kind but overwhelmed. Columbus had dozens of similar cases that year. They took her statement, collected evidence, told her they'd do everything they could. But weeks turned into months, and the investigation went cold. No security footage that captured his face clearly. No DNA matches in the system. No witnesses who saw anything useful. The detective assigned to her case, a woman named Officer Patricia Chen, called every few weeks with updates that weren't really updates at all. Sarah went through the motions of healing. She saw a therapist for 6 months, talking through the trauma until the weekly crying sessions became bi-weekly, then monthly. She learned all the right words. Processing. Survivor, not victim. It wasn't your fault. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different countries separated by an ocean of shame she couldn't quite cross. Here's what they don't tell you about trauma. It doesn't just live in your mind or your body. It lives in the spaces between who you were and who you're trying to become. Sarah before the attack was confident, maybe even a little naive about the world's dangers. Sarah after was careful in ways that looked like paranoia to people who didn't know. She stopped working late. She moved to a building with doorman security. She took self-defense classes until her knuckles were permanently bruised. And she made a decision that would haunt her for years. She decided not to tell anyone new in her life what had happened. Her family knew, her old college friends knew, her therapist knew. But anyone she met after that night in the parking garage would meet a version of Sarah that had edited out those 10 minutes. She told herself it was about moving forward, not letting what happened define her. But really, it was about control. If people didn't know, they couldn't pity her. They couldn't see her as broken. They couldn't treat her differently. 2 years after the attack, Sarah met Michael at a friend's barbecue in a suburb outside Columbus. He was an engineer for a manufacturing company, steady and reliable with an easy laugh and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours, sprawling from the backyard to a coffee shop to a walk around a park as the sun set. He told her about growing up in a big family, 4 siblings who still did Sunday dinners at their parents' house. She told him about her marketing job, her love of old movies, her plan to someday travel to every national park. It felt natural, comfortable, like finding a pair of shoes that fit perfectly on the first try. He asked her out before they left the park, and she said yes without the hesitation that had accompanied every date in the previous 2 years. Something about Michael felt safe. Maybe that was the beginning of her mistake. They fell in love the way people do in small towns and romantic movies. Slowly, then all at once. Coffee dates turned into weekend trips. He met her parents, she met his. They found a rhythm that felt effortless, finishing each other's sentences and knowing what the other needed before words were necessary. Michael's family embraced her like she'd always been part of them. His mother, Margaret, pulled her aside at Thanksgiving dinner 6 months into their relationship and whispered that she'd never seen her son so happy. His younger sister, Emma, told Sarah she was the sister she'd always wanted. His father, Robert, taught her how to fish on their family trips to Lake Erie, patient with her tangles and celebrating her first catch like it was a championship trophy. Sarah belonged in a way she hadn't felt since before that night split her life into before and after. But intimacy is where her secret started to create problems she couldn't quite explain. When Michael first kissed her, really kissed her with intention and desire, she froze for just a second. Long enough that he pulled back, concerned, asking if she was okay. She'd laughed it off, said she was nervous, and he'd been so gentle about it that she almost told him right then. But the moment passed, and the words stayed locked inside. Their physical relationship developed slowly, which Michael attributed to her traditional upbringing and religious background. He never pushed, never pressured, and Sarah was grateful for his patience even as she hated herself for not being honest about why she needed it. She wanted him. She loved him. But sometimes when they were close, her mind would flash to that parking garage, to hands that weren't gentle, to a violation that had nothing to do with love. She'd learned techniques from her therapist to stay present, to remind herself that Michael was safe, that this was different. And mostly, it worked. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. When Michael proposed after 2 years together, on a beach in South Carolina where they'd gone for a long weekend, Sarah cried so hard she couldn't speak for 5 minutes. He'd planned it perfectly, sunset and candles and a speech about building a life together that made her believe in fresh starts. She said yes through her tears, and when he slipped the ring on her finger, she made a silent promise to herself. She would tell him. Before the wedding, she would find the courage to explain about the attack, about why she sometimes flinched at unexpected touches, about the nightmares she occasionally had that she blamed on stress from work. She would give him the chance to fully know her before they made their vows permanent. But days became weeks, and weeks became months, and every time she got close to the conversation, her throat would close up with fear. What if he looked at her differently? What if he couldn't handle it? What if he decided she was too damaged, too complicated, too much work? The year of their engagement was consumed with wedding planning. Sarah threw herself into details, color schemes and seating charts and menu tastings, anything to distract from the growing weight of her unspoken truth. Michael's family helped plan everything, their small-town church wedding expanding to accommodate relatives Sarah had never met but who all seemed genuinely thrilled for the young couple. Margaret took Sarah shopping for her dress, crying in the bridal boutique when Sarah stepped out in a simple lace gown that somehow made her look both elegant and innocent. That word, innocent, made Sarah's stomach turn. She wasn't lying to Michael, exactly. He'd never directly asked about her past relationships, and she'd never explicitly said she hadn't experienced trauma. But lies of omission can weigh just as heavy as lies spoken out loud. The wedding date approached like a train she couldn't stop, and Sarah's anxiety grew with each crossed-off item on her checklist. 3 months before the wedding, she tried to tell him. They were in his apartment, cooking dinner together, and he was talking about their honeymoon plans, excited about the resort in Jamaica he'd booked. She opened her mouth, the words right there. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you about, something that happened to me a few years ago." But he'd chosen that exact moment to wrap his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, and the affection in the gesture made her freeze again. He felt her tense and loosened his grip, asking again if she was okay. She said she was fine, just thinking about work, and the moment dissolved like morning fog. She told herself she'd find another time, a better time. But better times have a way of never quite arriving when you're avoiding a difficult conversation. The weeks melted into days, the days into hours, and suddenly it was the night before her wedding and Sarah still hadn't said the words that needed saying. The wedding day itself was beautiful in the way that small-town weddings often are, full of genuine love and community and people who'd known you since you were a child. The church was packed, every pew filled with family and friends who'd come to celebrate. Sarah's father walked her down the aisle, and she could see tears in Michael's eyes as he watched her approach. The ceremony was traditional, vows they'd written themselves mixed with scripture and prayers that had married generations of couples before them. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and Michael kissed her for the first time as her husband, the church erupted in applause and Sarah felt a flutter of hope that maybe, her secret wouldn't matter. Maybe what they had was strong enough that her past didn't need to be excavated. Maybe she could just be the woman Michael believed her to be and leave that parking garage 6 years in the past where it belonged. But trauma doesn't work that way. You can't selectively forget the things that shaped you, even the things you wish had never happened. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with fairy lights and mason jar centerpieces that Sarah's bridesmaids had spent weeks preparing. They danced their first dance to an old jazz standard, and Michael whispered in her ear that he was the luckiest man alive. They cut the cake, tossed the bouquet, and Sarah's best friend from college, Rachel, caught it with a laugh, joking that she'd be next even though she was perpetually single. As the evening wound down and guests started to leave, calling out well wishes and advice, Sarah felt her anxiety building again. The hotel suite Michael had booked was beautiful, a historic property downtown with a 4-poster bed and champagne waiting on ice. This was supposed to be the perfect beginning to their life together. But Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she had to grip her bouquet tighter to hide it. In the car ride to the hotel, Michael reached over to hold her hand, and she forced herself not to pull away even though her whole body felt electrified with tension. The hotel room was exactly as promised, romantic and elegant with rose petals scattered across the bed and soft music playing from a speaker someone had set up. Michael opened the champagne, poured 2 glasses, and they toasted to their future. He was being so sweet, so patient, not rushing anything, and Sarah knew she was running out of time to explain. The problem was, she didn't know how to start. How do you tell your husband on your wedding night that the assumptions he's made about you aren't entirely accurate? How do you explain that your hesitation isn't about him, it's about a stranger who took something from you years ago without permission? She sipped her champagne too fast, trying to calm her racing heart, but alcohol on an empty stomach just made her feel unsteady. Michael noticed, of course he noticed, he was attentive to every shift in her mood. He asked if she wanted to just go to sleep, said they had their whole lives ahead and there was no pressure. His kindness made it worse somehow. She didn't deserve this gentle man who was trying so hard to make everything perfect. If this hooked you already, don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop a comment because what happens next will absolutely shatter your expectations. That's when it all came crashing down. Michael reached to brush a strand of hair from her face, a gesture he'd made 1,000 times before, but this time Sarah couldn't control her reaction. She flinched hard, pulling back so quickly she nearly dropped her champagne glass. The look on Michael's face shifted from concern to confusion to something that looked almost like hurt. He asked what was wrong, really wrong, because this was more than just wedding night nerves. And Sarah knew, in that moment, that she couldn't hide anymore. The secret had built up so much pressure inside her that it was going to come out one way or another, and messy honesty was better than continued deception. She set down her glass with trembling hands and told him they needed to talk. The 4 words every person dreads hearing, especially on what should be the happiest night of their relationship. Michael sat down on the edge of the bed, his expression already bracing for impact, and Sarah stood in front of him in her wedding dress, still beautiful and perfect on the outside, while inside she felt like she was falling apart. She started talking, and once the words began, they poured out in a rush that didn't give her time to second guess. She told him about the night in the parking garage, about the attack, about the investigation that went nowhere and the therapy that helped but couldn't erase what happened. She told him about the decision to not tell new people, about how when they met she convinced herself it didn't matter because she was past it, because she'd healed, because she didn't want to be defined by one terrible thing. She told him about all the times she almost said something, all the moments when the truth sat on her tongue but fear swallowed it back down. And she told him she was sorry, so sorry, for not being brave enough to be completely honest before they made their vows. The whole confession took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours, and when she finally stopped talking, the silence in that hotel room was deafening. Michael hadn't interrupted once. He just sat there, his face cycling through emotions too fast for her to read, and now he was staring at his hands like they might tell him what to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled in a way that told Sarah he was working hard to keep it that way. He asked why she didn't tell him. Not angry, just bewildered. They'd talked about everything, he thought, shared their dreams and fears and histories. Why this? Why had she kept this from him? Sarah tried to explain about the shame, about not wanting to be seen as a victim, about being afraid he'd look at her differently. But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The truth was more complicated than that. The truth was she'd been a coward, choosing her own comfort over his right to know the full person he was marrying. She'd made a decision for both of them without giving him the chance to be part of it, and now she could see in his eyes that he was realizing the same thing. This wasn't just about a traumatic event from her past. This was about trust, about the foundation they'd built, about whether you can truly know someone who's kept a piece of themselves hidden. Michael stood up, walked to the window overlooking the city lights, his back to her. The silence stretched out again, and Sarah felt her heart breaking with each passing second. She told him she understood if he needed time, if he was angry, if this changed things between them. That seemed to unlock something in him because he turned around, and she could see tears in his eyes for the second time that day. But these weren't the happy tears from the ceremony. These were tears of betrayal, of hurt, of a man trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the truth now standing in front of him. He said he wasn't angry about what happened to her. How could he be angry about something terrible that was done to her? But he was angry that she didn't trust him enough to tell him. They'd been together for 3 years. They'd just promised before God and everyone they knew to be honest and faithful. And she'd walked into their marriage carrying a secret she should have shared months, even years ago. His voice cracked on the last part, and Sarah wanted to reach for him but didn't know if she still had that right. The next part of the conversation gets harder to talk about because it ventured into territory neither of them was equipped to handle on their wedding night. Michael asked questions Sarah had hoped he wouldn't, about her therapy, about whether she was still struggling, about what this meant for their relationship moving forward. He asked if there were other things she hadn't told him, and she swore there weren't. This was the only significant secret, but she could see in his face that her credibility had taken a hit. How could he believe her now when she'd proven she was capable of hiding something this important? They went in circles for what felt like hours, Sarah trying to explain, Michael trying to understand, both of them exhausted and emotional and completely unprepared for this conversation in the midst of what should have been celebration. Eventually, Michael said he needed space to think. Not a separation, not a threat, just honesty that he couldn't process all of this with her in the room looking at him with those desperate eyes. He grabbed his jacket and said he was going to take a walk, clear his head. Sarah asked if he was coming back, and the pause before he said yes told her everything she needed to know about how badly she'd damaged his trust. After Michael left, Sarah sat on that hotel bed still in her wedding dress, surrounded by rose petals and champagne glasses and the debris of a romantic evening that had imploded. She called Rachel, her best friend, the one who'd caught the bouquet just hours earlier, and tried to explain what happened through tears that made her words almost incomprehensible. Rachel listened, asked a few gentle questions, and then said something Sarah needed to hear. She said that secrets don't keep us safe, they keep us isolated. And isolation is its own kind of prison. Sarah knew she was right. She'd thought she was protecting herself by not telling Michael, but really she'd just been building walls that were always going to crumble eventually. The only question was whether Michael would still be there when the dust settled, or if she'd pushed him away with the very fear that made her hide in the first place. Rachel offered to come to the hotel, but Sarah said no. This was something she and Michael had to work through on their own. She just had to wait and see if he'd give her that chance. Michael came back 3 hours later. Sarah had changed out of her wedding dress, couldn't bear to sit in it anymore, and was curled up in a hotel bathrobe when she heard his key card in the door. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened and his eyes red-rimmed. They stared at each other across the room, and Sarah braced herself for whatever he was about to say. But instead of more questions or accusations, Michael crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. Not a romantic embrace, just a tight hug that felt more like desperation than affection. He whispered into her hair that he was sorry, he was so sorry that happened to her, and she started crying again because that response was somehow harder to accept than anger would have been. She didn't want his pity. She wanted his trust back. But Michael kept holding her, and slowly Sarah understood that this wasn't pity. This was grief. He was mourning for the pain she'd carried alone, for the years they could have faced it together if only she'd let him in. They talked through the night, not sleeping, not celebrating, just talking. Michael shared his own fears, things he'd never articulated before about feeling like he wasn't enough, like Sarah had always held part of herself back and now he knew why, but it didn't make it easier. Sarah opened up more than she ever had, not just about the attack but about the aftermath, the therapy, the ways it had shaped her approach to relationships and intimacy and trust. It was raw and uncomfortable and necessary, the conversation they should have had before exchanging vows but were having now because there was no going back. As dawn started to break through the hotel curtains, they were both emotionally drained but somehow closer than they'd been in months. The secret that had felt like a wall between them was now just air, visible but not solid, something they could move through together. Michael asked what she needed from him moving forward, and Sarah said honesty, patience, and the willingness to not treat her like she was fragile. She'd survived something terrible, but she was still whole. She just needed him to see all of her, not just the parts she'd been showing. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe and let's prove her wrong. What happened next wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything immediately got better. Real life doesn't work that way, especially when trust has been fractured. Michael and Sarah spent their honeymoon in Jamaica mostly talking, working through layers of hurt and misunderstanding that had been building since the day they met. They found a couples therapist when they got back, someone who specialized in trauma and relationships, and started the hard work of rebuilding. The first few sessions were brutal, both of them facing truths about themselves and their relationship that were uncomfortable but necessary. Sarah had to confront her tendency to hide instead of being vulnerable. Michael had to examine his assumptions about what honesty looked like and why he'd never questioned the gaps in Sarah's history. They learned to communicate in ways they'd thought they were already doing but really weren't. They discovered that love alone isn't enough to sustain a marriage. You also need transparency, accountability, and the courage to keep choosing each other even when it's difficult. If you're still here, subscribe, because stories like this only work when people stay. 6 months after their wedding, things were different between them, but different in ways that felt stronger rather than broken. Sarah had nightmares occasionally, and instead of hiding them or making excuses about work stress, she woke Michael up and let him hold her until she felt grounded again. Michael learned to recognize the signs when Sarah was struggling, the subtle tension in her shoulders or the way she'd go quiet during conversations about certain topics, and he'd check in without making a big deal of it. They developed a language of small gestures and honest words that their relationship had been missing before. It wasn't perfect. Sarah still carried guilt about the secret she'd kept, and Michael still had moments when he wondered what else might be hiding beneath the surface, but they were learning to sit with those uncomfortable feelings instead of running from them. Their families noticed the shift, though no one except Rachel knew the whole story. Margaret commented that they seemed more connected somehow, like they'd weathered a storm together and come out knowing each other better. The real test came a year after their wedding when the detective, Officer Chen, called Sarah out of the blue. They'd made an arrest in her case. A man had been picked up for a similar assault in a neighboring county, and when they ran his DNA against unsolved cases, Sarah's matched. He was going to trial, and the prosecutor wanted to know if Sarah would be willing to testify. The call brought everything flooding back, all the fear and shame and violation she'd worked so hard to process. But this time, she didn't face it alone. She told Michael immediately, and together they decided she would testify. It was terrifying, sitting in that courtroom describing the worst night of her life to a room full of strangers. But Michael was there in the gallery, his presence a steady anchor, and when it was over and the jury delivered a guilty verdict, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Relief. Not healing, exactly, because healing isn't linear and trauma doesn't just disappear. But a sense that she'd taken back some of the power that had been stolen from her in that parking garage. That night, after the verdict, Sarah and Michael sat in their living room, the same furniture they'd picked out together, the same photos on the walls from their wedding day. Sarah looked at her husband, this man who'd chosen to stay even when she'd given him every reason to leave, and told him she loved him in a way that felt different than all the times before. This wasn't the easy love of their early days when everything was new and uncomplicated. This was the hard-earned love of two people who'd seen each other's worst moments and decided that what they had was worth fighting for. Michael said he loved her too, and then he said something that made Sarah cry for the 100th time that year. He said her story, their story, wasn't about a secret or a betrayal or a trauma. It was about two imperfect people learning to be honest in a world that often rewards hiding. And that was the most beautiful thing he could think of. If you're watching this and you've experienced trauma, I want you to know something. Sarah's story isn't unique. Thousands of survivors carry secrets because they're afraid of being defined by what happened to them. They worry about judgment, about pity, about changing the way people see them. But isolation doesn't protect you. It just makes the weight heavier. And while Sarah's decision to hide her trauma nearly cost her marriage, the decision to finally speak her truth is what saved it. Not every story ends with understanding and reconciliation. Some partners can't handle the revelation, some relationships are too damaged to repair, and that's a painful reality. But you deserve people in your life who can hold your whole story, the beautiful parts and the broken parts and everything in between. You deserve to be known fully, not just the version of yourself you think is acceptable. What Michael discovered on his wedding night wasn't just that his wife had kept a secret. It was that the woman he loved had survived something horrific and managed to build a life anyway. She'd gone to therapy, moved forward in her career, opened herself to love again even when it was terrifying. She was stronger than he'd ever imagined, and the secret wasn't a sign of her weakness. It was a sign of how much she'd been hurt and how hard she'd worked to not let it define her. His journey was learning to see that strength instead of focusing only on the dishonesty. And Sarah's journey was learning that vulnerability isn't weakness either. It's the bridge that connects us to other people, the thing that makes love possible in the first place. 2 years after their wedding, Sarah and Michael welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Hope. The name was deliberate, chosen because it represented what they'd learned together. That even after trauma, after secrets, after nights that feel like the world is ending, there can be new beginnings. Sarah was terrified during her pregnancy, worried about how her past might affect her ability to be a mother, but those fears turned out to be largely unfounded. She was gentle and patient and sometimes overprotective, but Michael helped balance that out. They were a team in a way they hadn't been before everything came to light. And when Sarah looked at her daughter, she made a silent promise that this little girl would grow up knowing she could tell her parents anything, that secrets were heavier than truth, and that shame had no place in their home. The marriage counselor they'd worked with told them something in one of their final sessions that stuck with both of them. She said that crisis doesn't create character, it reveals it. The wedding night revelation didn't make Michael compassionate or Sarah brave. Those qualities were already there, waiting for a moment that demanded they show up. The crisis just gave them the opportunity to choose who they wanted to be. They could have let betrayal and hurt destroy what they'd built, or they could use it as a foundation for something stronger. They chose the latter, and that choice was the real love story. Not the wedding day with its perfect flowers and vows, but the messy middle when everything felt uncertain and they decided to stay anyway. I want to ask you something, and I really want you to think about it before answering in the comments. If you were Michael, what would you have done? If the person you just married revealed a traumatic secret they'd kept for years, could you have found it in yourself to choose compassion over anger? And if you were Sarah, would you have had the courage to speak your truth, knowing it might cost you everything? These aren't easy questions. There are no objectively right answers. But they're questions worth considering because most of us will face moments in our relationships when we have to decide between protecting ourselves and being vulnerable, between demanding perfection from our partners and accepting their complicated humanity. How we navigate those moments determines not just the fate of our relationships but who we become in the process. Sarah's story also raises questions about what we owe the people we love. Is complete honesty always the best policy, or are there some truths that don't need sharing? When does omission become deception, and when is privacy just healthy boundaries? These are complex ethical questions that don't have simple answers, and different couples will draw those lines in different places. But what Sarah and Michael learned is that for their relationship to work, they needed transparency about the things that shaped them. Not every detail of every day, but the big things, the formative experiences, the traumas and triumphs that made them who they are. Without that foundation of shared history, they were building on sand instead of solid ground. There's a broader conversation here too about how we treat survivors of sexual assault in our society. Sarah's fear of judgment wasn't irrational. She'd seen how people talked about victims, questioning what they were wearing or whether they fought back hard enough or why they didn't report immediately. She'd internalized those messages, and they convinced her that being a survivor was something to hide rather than acknowledge. That's a cultural problem, not an individual one. We need to create space for people to speak their truths without fear of being defined or diminished by what happened to them. We need to understand that trauma is complicated, that healing isn't linear, and that survivors don't owe us perfect responses to imperfect situations. Sarah's wedding night could have gone differently if she'd lived in a world where survivorship wasn't wrapped in shame. But she didn't, and neither do we yet, so stories like hers matter because they challenge us to do better. Michael's response matters too because it models something we don't see enough of in discussions about trauma and relationships. He had every right to feel hurt and betrayed by Sarah's secrecy. Those feelings were valid and important to acknowledge. But he didn't let those feelings be the end of the story. He did the difficult work of holding multiple truths at once, that Sarah's trauma wasn't about him, but her decision to hide it affected him. That he could be hurt by her choices and still have compassion for her pain. That love sometimes means sitting in discomfort and confusion while you figure out the path forward together. Too often we're presented with binary choices in relationships: stay or leave, forgive or resent, accept completely or reject entirely. But real love lives in the nuance, in the ability to say this is hard and I don't know if we'll make it through but I'm willing to try. What would you do if someone you loved had kept a secret like this? Would you be able to separate the trauma they experienced from the deception they chose? Could you understand their fear without excusing the impact of their silence? I'm asking because these questions aren't academic. Every relationship involves moments when we discover our partners aren't exactly who we thought they were. Sometimes that's about major revelations like Sarah's. Sometimes it's smaller things, misrepresented history, or exaggerated accomplishments or hidden debts. But the underlying question is always the same: can you love the real person in front of you, or were you only ever in love with the image they presented? And can they love the real you, with all your reactions and judgments and imperfections? These are the questions that determine whether relationships survive their crucible moments. Sarah and Michael would tell you their marriage isn't perfect even now, years later. They still fight about mundane things like whose turn it is to do dishes or how to manage their budget. They still have moments when old wounds resurface, when Sarah feels the weight of her initial deception or Michael struggles with wondering if there's anything else he doesn't know. But they've learned to talk through those moments instead of letting them fester. They've learned that trust isn't a light switch you turn on once and forget about. It's a muscle you have to exercise constantly, through small acts of honesty and vulnerability that add up over time. They've learned that you can't heal from trauma by pretending it didn't happen, but you also can't let it be the only thing that defines you. And they've learned that the strongest foundations are built not during the easy times but during the moments when everything feels like it's falling apart and you have to actively choose to hold on. The question I keep coming back to is this: what if Sarah had never told Michael? What if she'd swallowed her secret and carried it to her grave, letting him believe his assumptions about her past were true? Would their marriage have been happier? Simpler? Or would the unspoken truth have poisoned things slowly, creating distance she couldn't explain and he couldn't understand? There's no way to know for certain, but Sarah believes now that the truth was always going to surface in some form. Maybe not on their wedding night, maybe years later in a different crisis, but eventually. Because you can't genuinely connect with someone while hiding a fundamental part of your story. The intimacy they have now, built on difficult honesty and hard-won understanding, wouldn't have been possible if Sarah had kept her secret. Sometimes the painful path is actually the only path to real connection. I also think about the timing of Sarah's revelation. The wedding night was terrible timing in obvious ways. It cast a shadow over what should have been pure joy and put Michael in an impossible position when he should have been celebrating. But in another way, maybe it was perfect timing. Before their vows, Michael could have walked away more easily. After years of building a life together, after children and mortgages and merged identities, leaving becomes exponentially harder. But on their wedding night, they were still in that liminal space where the commitment was new enough to test but serious enough to fight for. They were forced to decide immediately what their marriage would be built on: comfortable illusions or uncomfortable truths. And because they chose truth, even messy and painful truth, they built something that could weather the storms that inevitably come. Here's what I want you to take away from Sarah and Michael's story. First, your trauma doesn't disqualify you from love, but hiding it makes real love impossible. Second, people who truly love you can handle your truth, even when it's hard and complicated and doesn't fit the narrative they had in their heads. Third, the right person won't run when they see your scars. They'll ask how they can help you carry what you've been carrying alone. Fourth, secrets kept out of shame are different from healthy privacy, and learning to tell the difference can save your relationships. And fifth, the most powerful thing you can do in a relationship is choose to stay and do the work when everything in you wants to run. If you found this story powerful, I need you to do something for me. Comment below and tell me, have you ever kept a secret from someone you loved because you were afraid of how they'd react? You don't have to share details, just let me know you're out there. Because I think Sarah's story resonates with so many people precisely because we've all been there in some form. We've all hidden parts of ourselves out of fear, and we've all wondered if we'd be loved if people saw the whole truth. This story is a reminder that the answer is often yes. Not always, not guaranteed, but often enough that the risk of vulnerability is worth taking. The people who matter won't run. They'll pull up a chair and ask you to tell them more. Before we end, I want to circle back to where we started. That chapel in Ohio, the bride in white lace with tears in her eyes, the groom who thought he knew everything about the woman he was marrying. If you could go back to that moment knowing what you know now, what would you tell them? Would you warn Sarah to speak her truth sooner, or would you tell her it's okay to protect herself until she feels safe? Would you tell Michael to ask more questions, or would you say his trust was beautiful and shouldn't be seen as naive? I don't think there are wrong answers here. I think different people in different circumstances need different things. But I do think both of them would tell you that honesty, even when it's excruciating, is the foundation everything else has to rest on. What Michael discovered on his wedding night did make him cry. Sarah told me that in the weeks that followed, she'd sometimes find him sitting alone just processing everything, tears running down his face. But those weren't just tears of hurt or betrayal. They were tears for what Sarah had endured alone, tears for the fear that made her hide, tears for the complexity of loving another imperfect human being. And eventually, they were tears of gratitude that they'd survived the revelation and chosen each other again on the other side. The discovery changed everything, absolutely everything, but not in the way you might expect. It didn't destroy their marriage. It refined it. It burned away the pretense and the carefully curated images and left only the raw truth of two people committed to building something real. So let me ask you one final question, and I really want you to engage with this in the comments because your perspective matters. Knowing what you know now about Sarah and Michael's journey, would you call their wedding night a tragedy or a gift? Was it the worst possible timing for a revelation that nearly destroyed them, or was it the catalyst that forced them to build something stronger than what they had before? I've thought about this a lot, and I honestly don't know. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's neither. Maybe it's just what happened, and they made the best of an impossible situation. But I do know this, their story challenges us to think differently about secrets, about shame, about what we owe each other in relationships. And that's worth sitting with, even when it's uncomfortable. If this story affected you, if it made you think or feel or question something about your own life, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story. Because there are thousands of stories like Sarah and Michael's out there, stories about real people navigating impossible choices and finding their way through darkness to something that looks like light. Stories that remind us we're not alone in our struggles, that other people have faced similar crossroads and survived. Stories that challenge our assumptions about love and trust and redemption. And I want to keep telling them, keep exploring these complicated human experiences that don't have easy answers but are worth examining anyway. Thank you for staying with me through this whole journey. Thank you for caring about Sarah and Michael, two people you've never met but who represent something universal about the human experience. Thank you for being willing to sit with difficult questions instead of demanding simple answers. And thank you for being part of this community where we can discuss these things with empathy and honesty. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story. Because there's always another story, always another person whose life can teach us something about our own. And together, we're building a space where those stories can be told and heard with the compassion they deserve.